dirt trails and the byways, the only way to get anywhere. The smoke haze makes a dark day, fills your lungs with ash and despair, and the prayers of the people cut off by the fire line. Homeless birds fly in dense clouds, don't look back, there's no delay. Wildlife crosses treacherous highways, gambling for another day. Hear the prayers of the people cut off by the fire line. The front line offer their lives up, most return for another day. Haunting memories follow, they must learn to hold them all at bay. Hear the prayers of your heroes, the nightmares of broken heroes cut off by the fire line. It was just a dream, left behind by your father, your family torn apart at the seams. Hear the prayers of your loved ones cut off by the fire line. Black, dead and new. The earth is bare, where tall trees grew. But I see the green coming through, making all things new. Shoots rise where old limbs fell, like the saints let out of hell. Creation wakes, it makes a way. This land will sing birds again. Fire up, there's no time for you to mourn. What's gone is slowly being reborn. Stand tall and open your weary eyes. From the ashes we will rise. Black, dead and new. The earth is bare, where tall trees grew. But I see the green coming through, making all things new. Shoots rise old limbs fill like the saints let out of hell. Creation wakes, it makes a way. This land will sing with birds again. Fire up, there's no time for you to mourn. What's gone is slowly being reborn. Stand tall and open your weary eyes. From the ashes we will rise. Boulders as bare as bones, they scar the earth, all is exposed. The mighty cedars, the gums and firs are breaking through now. Returns. Fire up, there's no time for you to mourn. What's gone is slowly being reborn. Stand tall and open your weary eyes. From the ashes we will rise. I see the rain rolling through, washing all things new. From the ashes, hope it prevails for those whose eyes are off themselves. Fear will flee where courage stands. Put on your boots now and lend a hand. Fire up, there's no time for you to mourn. What's gone is slowly being reborn. Stand tall and open your weary eyes. From the ashes we will rise.
Over the past 2 decades, bushfire seasons have become noticeably worse, both here in Australia and around the world. The loss of life and vast damage to property and the environment was due in many cases to catastrophic firestorms. These unique storms develop rapidly and erratically, often preventing safe evacuations and proving extremely hard to model and manage. Our current predictive models are based on a small, well-defined line of fire that grows with a roughly constant speed. The reality of firestorms is much more complicated. As fires grow, critical changes in the landscape and weather conditions can cause a relatively benign fire to suddenly escalate. flying embers lead to localised spot fires, which can coalesce, forming new blazes and multiple fire fronts. The behaviour of the fire is now very difficult to predict. As the plume of a large intense fire reaches high enough into the atmosphere, moisture from the burnt fuel can condense and begin to form its own weather system, known as a firestorm or pyrocumulonimbus. Intense downdrafts and erratic winds spread the fire further, and dry lightning strikes ignite new blazes that merge with the main fire. This firestorm is well beyond suppression. These extreme fire scenarios are becoming more common. Between 2000 and 2018, 46 firestorms were confirmed in Australia. In the 2019-20 season alone, we experienced at least 35 such events. We must act now to develop improved predictive tools to mitigate the increasing threat of extreme fire behaviour. The University of New South Wales is a global leader in cutting-edge research into bushfire dynamics, simulation and modelling. UNSW researchers have already provided a number of significant insights into extreme bushfires, and the opportunity exists to build upon this work. Using this research, analysts will be able to more accurately predict which fires will develop into firestorms and better model their spread across the landscape. This will enable emergency services to better fight fires and protect vulnerable communities and ecosystems, ultimately saving countless lives.
And hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Good evening. I'm Professor Emma Johnston. I'm Dean of Science at UNSW Sydney, and I'm your host for this important discussion. I'd like to begin by acknowledging Gadigal people, the traditional custodians of the land from which I'm joining you this evening. They're acknowledging their elders past and present, and their continuing connections to country and the deep knowledge that emanates from those connections. I'd also like to acknowledge on your behalf all of the traditional lands from which you might be joining us this evening, and encourage you to pop into the chat the lands from which you're joining us. It's a diverse audience, and of course it is NAIDOC Week, a really important week to acknowledge and celebrate traditional Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures, their heritage and their deep wisdom, and to talk about the importance of protecting and promoting their culture and heritage. We'll be speaking directly to some of that importance in relation to NAIDOC theme this week, which is Healing Country. I'll talk more about that later. But tonight we join you for a very important discussion around bushfires and resilience. Bushfires, how they're changing and how we can build our resilience to them. We were looking forward to hosting this event from the Southern Highlands. However, we obviously need to be adaptable in current times. So thank you again for joining us online. This is an important conversation for communities across Australia. And so we welcome the opportunity to join together, not only to hear from the expert panelists, but to invite your questions later in the evening. Audience members can participate in the discussion via the YouTube stream. You can post comments and questions there. Please remain respectful, of course, and I'll endeavour to incorporate as many of those questions into the conversation as possible. We've already had prior questions come in, and I have incorporated as many of those questions as I could into the conversation, so it should be very lively and very relevant to the audience. So why are we here? Australian environments have evolved in the context of and in response to a series of different extreme events or climatic events: tropical cyclones, hailstorms, flooding rains, storm tides, heat waves, blizzards, and of course bushfires. Events which sometimes only last a few hours or perhaps a few days, but can cause massive disruption. Climate change is predicted to exacerbate many of these events and their impacts. Extreme versions of already extreme events are emerging, and high fire danger days are likely to become more frequent and more dangerous. So today we focus on bushfires. We focus on the new extreme forms of bushfires, how they're changing and what we can do to build resilience. To help us discuss these issues, we've assembled a panel of experts, deep expertise with lived experience of bushfires. This expertise is spanning the physical sciences, the psychology of resilience, the policy and planning responses to bushfires, and of course, the ecological impacts. Let me briefly introduce to you our speakers this evening. First up, Professor Jason Sharples, a Bundjalung man and a mathematical scientist. Jason is an internationally recognised expert in dynamic bushfire behaviour and extreme bushfire development. He is the director of the UNSW Bushfire Research Group, which aims to improve understanding of the fundamental processes that drive extreme bushfire development and their relation to firefighter and community safety. Welcome, Jason. Next up, Emerita Professor Mary O'Kane is the chair of the New South Wales Independent Planning Commission and executive chairman of O'Kane Associates. Some of her previous roles include chief scientist and engineer for New South Wales and vice-chancellor of the University of Adelaide. Most recently, Emerita Professor O'Kane was one of the co-leads of the New South Wales government inquiry into the 2019-2020 bushfire season. Next, Scientia Professor Richard Bryant, also from the University of New South Wales. He's the director of the Traumatic Stress Clinic. He's researched the nature, course and development and treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder, or what you might have heard of as PTSD. That research has been ongoing for 30 years. Recently, Professor Bryant and his team have been engaged by Emergency Management Australia to establish ongoing mental health services for emergency service workers, including firefighters, police and paramedics and their families who are affected by the 2019-2020 fire season. And finally, Casey Kirchhoff. Casey is a PhD candidate at the UNSW Centre for Ecosystem Science, exploring the impact of climate change on Australian alpine plants. In early 2020, Casey founded the Environment Recovery Project after the devastating Southern Highlands Moreton bushfire destroyed her Winslow home. She's called on the community using the Citizen Science Initiative, giving people a chance to contribute to the understanding of how the natural environment recovers after disaster. And of course, I'm a marine and coastal scientist focused on human impacts in marine coastal environments. And for the first time ever, I pivoted my research team in early 2020 to examine the impacts of the bushfires on coastal environments in New South Wales, arguably the first time we've ever had to do so. So let's get started. Jason, Australia's no stranger to bushfires, but the 2019-2020 fires have often been labelled as unprecedented. In what way are they new in your experience?
Yes, I mean, they're unprecedented by a number of measures. I mean, the amount of forest burnt, if you add up the total sort of accumulated fire danger rating over the course of the summer, they're unprecedented in that respect as well. Also, the amount of power that was actually emitted by these fires, as measured by satellites, and the number of fires which actually develop into pyrocumulonimbus or firestorm events. So these sorts of fires, they're well beyond suppression. The sheer number of pyrocumulonimbus events we had meant that even just sort of trying to, understand the way individual fires developed became a real issue. And I mean, actually overwhelming, to be honest. But the way these fires behave, I mean, with the really, really dry fuels, very, very low fuel moisture contents, critically low fuel moisture contents, they tend to behave quite differently to ordinary fires that you might get in a typical season. Spotting becomes the dominant process driving them. You have all sorts of weird, atypical fire behaviours associated with the way the fires propagate. And, a lot of that can, as we've heard, seasoned firefighters get caught off guard when these sorts of fire behaviours are around. So, yeah, there was a lot of unique features to those fires.
Mm. And can we pinpoint why these fires are changing?
Yeah, well, I mean, climate change is an obvious factor in it. I mean, the sorts of extremely low fuel moisture contents that you get with these fires become more likely when conditions are warmer overall. They become more likely when you have extended droughts, which is one of the big factors that we had during the black summer season. There's also things we know less about, like the way that dangerous frontal systems come across the bottom, the southern part of Australia. Their connection with heat waves is another thing that we're really only starting to appreciate. And then how those sorts of things tend to affect not just the fine fuels that we're usually interested in when we think about fire behaviour, but also the larger fuel elements. So even to the point of where we need to consider the big logs that are dead and down on the forest floor.
So can you just explain for those of us who are not involved in fire science how you go about literally trying to predict a bushfire progress and development? And are you trying to do that in real time?
I mean, doing it in real time or faster than real time is the ultimate goal. But what we've tended to do over the last 10 years, 15 years or so, we've been doing this research, is to really try and pinpoint key processes which cause a small, ordinary fire to escalate into one of these large pyroconvective events. So we've been able to identify, particular roles that the terrain plays, how the winds interact with the terrain, and then the really complicated part is then when you need to consider how the fire actually interacts with the wind and the terrain as well. So these fires aren't, the ordinary fire which just creeps along the surface as a well-defined front. These fires escalate to the point where they couple strongly with the atmosphere. And so these interactions between the wind, the terrain, and the atmosphere become really critical in understanding, whether a certain fire is likely to develop into one of these large pyrocumulonimbus events. So what we've been doing is really trying to isolate some of the processes which arise as a result of those interactions, trying to understand the interactions a little bit better, and then based on that, trying to come up with models which you can use to predict when these things are going to occur.
And so I assume you're using supercomputers and very high-powered models at very fine scales. Yeah, we try to push the models we have to their limits in terms of the scales we use. I mean, a lot of these models are sort of weather prediction models, and if you go below sort of a few hundred meters, that's already pushing them. We've tended to push them down to sort of 50 or 30 meters in some cases, really to try and get a clear understanding of the detailed physics involved in these sorts of events. So while we use the big supercomputers and these really complicated models to try and understand the processes, what we then try and do is use that information to try and inform the development of models of reduced complexity, which we're then able to run faster than real time, which are the sorts of models you then can use to actually, predict what the fire is going to do sometime ahead of it actually getting to that part of the landscape. So Jason, you're at the cutting edge of understanding a brand new phenomenon, and a phenomenon that has massive implications for society. Are there international research teams, and I'm thinking particularly of our poor cousins in Canada who've recently been subject to some of the similar scale fires by the looks of it. It looks like the firestorms are happening not just in Canada, but in Northern America and also in Russia. Have you been working with people in those countries to try and understand this new phenomenon?
Yeah, I mean, it's by no means a phenomenon isolated to Australia. As you said, Western North America, California, British Columbia, places like that, northeastern Siberia, and even places like Bolivia, Chile, Portugal. We're all starting to get these events occurring now. So there is a strong sort of international connection amongst different research groups. I mean, we work very closely with some of the people in the US and in Portugal, for example, also in other parts of Europe. There's also a group which is kind of dedicated to monitoring these events. And that's an international group of scientists led by people out of naval research labs in the US. So they're really focused on identifying these results, these sorts of events as they happen, cataloguing them, trying to understand the way the weather was behaving around it, what sort of fuels they were burning in, whether any of these dynamic fire behaviour processes were driving them. So yeah, there is a real international effort going on, and those connections are becoming stronger as the problem becomes more of a global one.
You've been able to help people in North America during this period, or give some advice?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the North American cases, they sort of come to us after the fact. So we've been involved a little bit in some of the accident reports that were occurred at the end of their 2020 season. Well, their season's sort of in the middle of the year, whereas ours is at the ends of the year. But yeah, I mean, certainly we keep in touch with colleagues over there, and if anything interesting comes up that we can help with, then that's something we definitely get involved in.
Thanks, Jason. I mean, and speaking of reports and post hoc analyses of the events, the Royal Commission into Natural Disaster Arrangements in 2020 made recommendations about how to better prepare Australia for climate-related extreme events, and the Commonwealth Government broadly accepted all of those recommendations. Inquiries into natural disasters by state and territory governments are also driving policy responses. Mary, I'm going to move to you now. You ran the New South Wales Government inquiry of the 2019-2020 bushfires. Did you find there were new situations resulting from these new types of fires, and what can we recommend in response to the evolving nature of these events?
We certainly did. There's been an enormous number of inquiries into bushfire in Australia since about 1927. And the numbers of inquiries has gone up drastically in the last 20 years. Yet the inquiry that we did, Dave Owens and I, for 2019-20 was different again. So one of the issues is we also found that we'd learnt a lot. So we didn't have the loss of life in 1920 that Victoria had for Black Saturday. But there are also things that we learned that we came across that we don't know the full answer to. So one of the great humbling experiences of the inquiry was beginning to see that we were looking at a different phenomenon, as you've highlighted in discussion with Jason, and to try and work out in the 6 months we were given to do the inquiry what we should do in response. And a lot of that comes into understanding. So we have a great set of recommendations on research and understanding in order to do appropriate messaging to people, because that was one of the biggest things people found, that they had lost connection and communications. They need to know what's going on. And then we talked at great length about how all sorts of systems in the state, and by implication the nation, would need to change, and how we'd have to be aware that even those changes themselves would have to change in time.
So some examples are distributed comm systems that are not vulnerable to big infrastructure failures. Is that the kind of thing you're talking about?
That's one sort of thing that, yes, redundancy in the system can be the sort of thing that you want. But relatively simple things we take for granted, one road in, one road out to a small village. That can be quite dangerous if the road gets cut off. But can we afford to put 2 roads into lots of our villages across the Great Divide? How we get lots of people, when all those people were moving from the south coast, a lot of people going back to Canberra, how we manage that, what we do about the planning system. Should people live in areas that are likely to get caught up in the future fires, and we can be pretty certain these fires are coming again? So it really touched a lot of things, and it also touched a lot of dealing with infrastructure, dealing with technology, dealing with the health system. In particular, the amount of smoke that we all remember going for months and months. Remember, these fires went from July of 2019, just a bit later than this time of the year, to the end of March 2020.
Yes, a phenomenal duration. And I guess that affects where we might choose to live, or where we might encourage people to live. Is it going that far? Are we at the point where there might be areas that we highlight as no-go zones?
It's a little bit more complicated than, say, with flood. Every time there's a big flood, we all get very cross and cranky and say people shouldn't be living there, and they shouldn't, because these days we have wonderful models of where the floods will happen, and people shouldn't be living in places that are very likely to flood. It's harder, and we're looking to Jason and all the other wonderful fire scientists about this, it's harder to predict exactly where the fires will come. There's no sort of floodplain equivalent, except there's a really big area where the eucalypts are, where there can possibly be fires. And one of the wonderful things that we learned from Jason and from the others is that we can probably do a lot more research on understanding the vulnerability. And I'd like to tell a little story here that was important to us. At about the time we were starting the inquiry, there was a story in the Financial Times which pointed out that in the 1950s, in the Netherlands, they'd had enormous floods because it is an underwater country, the Netherlands, after all. And after they'd lost so many people and so many villages, after one particularly bad incident, the Dutch decided that they would never lose somebody to these sorts of floods again. And that meant they became the best in the world at dealing with this sort of flooding and dealing, as we know, they've got a long history of dealing with dikes and managing sort of big opening gates and so on. And they've become the world experts in that. And our inquiry recommends that here in Australia, in New South Wales, we should become the capital of dealing with these new styles of bushfires and how we both live with them, fight them, and know about them.
And that's a really great ambition for a country and very appropriate for our area. So that's wonderful to hear. It also gives us some hope, I think, looking towards the future, that we can be so ambitious. But the fact is we did lose 34 lives in the last fires and an estimated another 417 from the effects of the smoke, I think, is my understanding. For those who survive, there can be ongoing impacts on mental health. So, Richard, I'm going to move to you now. You've studied post-traumatic stress disorder for more than 30 years. Are the stress responses to natural events the same as this, storms, floods, bushfires, to other types of trauma, or do we see a differentiation? Can you use some of the same techniques for treatment as you would for other human-induced trauma?
Well, Emma, there was a lot in that question. It's probably fair to say that we treat them the same, but in terms of are they the same? No. And I think there's a major difference between something like bushfires or other kinds of disaster, big natural disasters, and what we see after more discrete events like a motor vehicle accident is that with disasters, the effects are incredibly long-lasting. And it's not because it just affects an individual, it affects an entire community, an entire infrastructure. And we've seen time and time again that this just has an ongoing effect. Now, I actually started working with bushfires back in 1994 when we had a very bad fire season in New South Wales then. And it's interesting to sort of reflect on what we know now compared to what we know then in terms of psychological recovery, and it's vastly improved. And I'd probably refer mainly here to a study that I've been involved with for years now after Black Saturday in Victoria, which took over, the flames alone took over 170 lives. And we did a large study there that went and assessed over 1,000 people at 3 different time points, and we've recently done a 10-year follow-up of them. So we've mapped very carefully sort of how these people have travelled. And what's really interesting is if you look at the people in the worst affected regions that cop the brunt of the fires, 10 years later, 1 in 5 people still have a significant psychological problem. And that's pretty remarkable because normally we think people will tend to adapt. But here we are 10 years later and so many people still have a problem. And what's interesting is when we look at those people over time, they didn't always have a problem. Some of these people were doing great at the beginning. Then they started to have problems, and then they got better again, and then they had more problems. And essentially what we saw over time is that the people who are having problems at any particular time when we went and assessed them was because of just what sort of stress they were going through at that time. It's largely influenced by the initial disaster, the fire, but it's also the subsequent problems, which are huge after disasters. It might be financial, it could be loss of employment, it could be problems with insurance companies, rebuilding challenges, subsequent seasons. And what happens in a lot of regional Australia is just economic difficulties and drought. And we saw that whenever these things peaked for an individual, their mental health got worse. And I think this is one of the things that really makes disasters distinct, is that we know that they're never time limited. The after effects are really, really long term. And because they're long term, it means that the psychological effects are really long term. And, you know, and the other thing that worried us a lot about that Black Saturday study is that 10 years later, you know, the people who were most distressed, only a quarter of them had actually got help in the last year. And that's a problem too, in terms of just how governments are actually meeting the needs of people, and whether people are actually, you know, reaching out for the help that might be available.
And just on that, while we're talking about it, if people are needing help or wanting to reach out, there are some really good resources and services available. And we'll be putting a link in the chat for those who do wish to reach out. Richard, I think you've got some recommendations.
Yes, I mean, there are many, since the 1920 season, lots of resources have been made available, and it's particularly a lot in targeted the Southern Highlands and the Southern Coast. But to be honest, all over Australia. And there's one particular initiative that Department of Home Affairs, Emergency Management Australia initiated, and they funded us and Black Dog Institute at the university to provide this sort of national service. And if anybody's interested, or you know somebody who might think they might need it, they can just Google Bushfire Support Service. That's Bushfire Support Service. And it's actually a nice menu there of resources. People can do a self-assessment. It's very anonymous, confidential. It gives you an assessment, and there's also different apps that people can download, or even can go through to a free telehealth type service. And this is particularly for people who are involved in fighting the fires and their families. That's what this particular project's for. But there are many other services that are available, and I think that would be the best starting point.
Thanks, Richard. And that link has been, one of those links has been now posted in the chat. It's interesting that you bring up the confluence of events being one of the most problematic things, is that it's not just the fire, it's the after effects, it's the financial consequences, etc. But of course, we know with these extreme events that we're seeing at the moment, and the climatic-induced extreme events, it is the confluence of events that's making the fire more distinct. So the extreme drought for 2 years prior to, or a decade of drought plus 2 years of extremely low precipitation just before, would have been having impacts on communities already. And then the disaster of the fire happens. So there's ecological confluences, and then there's also all of the social consequences that tend to compound the impact. Really interesting.
And of course, Emma, the other thing you're not mentioning is the pandemic.
Yes.
And this has had a massive impact on people in terms of affecting tourism, for example, the flow on for economies, people's social interactions. And one of the things we found in our Black Saturday work very strongly is that how people are adapting is strongly influenced by communities interacting. And we all know this from a lot of work that's been done. It's the extent to which after a disaster, people can reach out to each other, connect with each other, and the communities that tend to adapt well, and the individuals in them who adapt well, is when there's cohesion in that community. COVID has not helped us do this, and it's just another challenge on top of, as you say, all the environmental ones.
And moving on, in an example of how people are connecting across communities, Casey, you are a good example, but what we're talking about in terms of the ecological effects was unprecedented scale of natural ecological systems being impacted. I mean, I think it was up to 20% or 21% of the New South Wales and Victorian temperate Australian broadleaf and mixed forests that were burnt during this single event. So 8.2 million hectares of natural veg was burnt. Indeed, in some of our major estuarine catchments that I work with, up to 92% of the catchment vegetation was burnt, which is why we are seeing impacts all the way down the river, right the way to the absolute coast, and for the first time documenting those impacts. But turning to the terrestrial ecosystems, Casey, you lost your house in the fires, and you're also an ecologist looking at those terrestrial ecosystems. Do you think the changing nature of the fires is causing a direct impact on the plants and animals? And, you know, how have you been able to bring community together to look at the response to the fire of those terrestrial ecosystems?
Thanks, Emma. I'd just like to first acknowledge this evening I'm on Gundagara country, and I'd like to acknowledge the elders past and present. So the ecological impacts of the current fires, I mean, it was building up to this point for quite some time. As others had mentioned, the ongoing drought and the drying out of the landscape and the fuel, along with climatic drivers and weather, really culminated in just the huge sheer scale of the bushfires that we saw. So some work out of University of Sydney put an estimate of over 3 billion animals having perished, not including invertebrates alone in this one fire event, which is just monumental. If you're considering it from a biomass perspective, there's a huge amount of organic matter being turned into charcoal. Obviously I was looking in my own backyard and seeing the landscape dry out around me leading up to the fires. And then, you know, the fires came through. After this point, I was obviously quite down seeing what had happened and losing my own house, but I really wanted to focus on a positive, and that was seeing some resprouting vegetation just a couple of days after the fires. So I'm talking three or 4 days after the fire had come through. You're getting the first sprouts coming through from some of the bog vegetation, which was really kind of what I hung my hat on, and I just fixated on that. And that kind of led to me obsessively looking around in my backyard for more things that were growing, more little green shoots, signs of animals. And I'd started discussing this with my supervisors at UNSW and some other team members up there at the Centre for Ecosystem Science. And we thought, hey, this could actually be, you know, maybe other people are going to want to be looking as well, looking in their own backyards, looking at places that have burnt, to try to find things that are coming back. So that was really the first seed for the citizen science project that we've ended up with, the Environment Recovery Project. So it really only took a couple of weeks after the fire that I was directly impacted from, and we had it launched, and people were on board immediately. We were getting hundreds of observations flooding into the project of people going out, giving really beautiful detailed descriptions of things that they were seeing. And since then, we've just really received some just monumental feedback about how helpful it has been for people to actually see these things, to go out and be more conscious of kind of the world around them, and see things kind of coming back after the fire.
That's a beautiful story, and it's also helping us understand ecosystem response. So very valuable citizen science project. Casey, there's a question from the audience about whether or not you'll be rebuilding in your own hometown.
Yes, actually, that's something we're currently in the thick of at the moment. So quite a lot of consideration has gone into that. Obviously, we're now thinking with more of a bushfire safety hat on when it comes to the house, but we're happy to say that we have a slab on the ground. You know, we've got some delays, but we should have a new house just about 2 years after the fire. So it's very exciting.
And are there ways we can rebuild that not only are more fire resilient, I guess, but also supporting natural ecosystems? Is that factoring into your reconstruction?
Yeah, absolutely. Being where we are, we're in quite a bushy area. We're in Wingelow in the Southern Highlands. It is actually meaning burning place or fire in Gundagara language. And I mean, some people would say, you know, you're mad to stay. What a lot of people sold and moved on, but we just really have such a connection to that little block of land of ours. And yeah, we need to be mindful about, you know, where we're putting plants in the future. We would like to be, you know, putting things in that are helpful for you know, animals in terms of our landscaping, but how close do we bring them to the house? We really need to be sensible with what we do on where the footprint of the house is.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Casey. And I'm going to move back to Jason now, because we've been talking a lot about vegetation and vegetation recovery post-fire. A lot of the intensity of the burn, by my understanding, is driven by what vegetation is already there, and particularly what dying or dead vegetation is there on the ground, which can be, you know, increased if there's a lot of leaf litter fall, and, you know, even cyclones that bring down trees can help bring fires into rainforest areas that we haven't seen happen before. How much do you factor that into your understanding and prediction of bushfires?
Yeah, I mean, the scale at which we sort of consider these types of fires, I guess, is a lot larger scale. So we sort of step back a fair bit when we look at these things. So we don't really tend to consider, you know, the fuels to that level of detail. I mean, it's important that you do have, you know, sufficient fuel there to carry the fire. But, you know, having said that, you can have interactions between, you know, two spot fires will actually increase their own intensity. Okay, even, you know, more than a single firewood burning the same fuel type. So it's really, I mean, fuel, I would say, doesn't really have a specific role in the sorts of work we do, other than you have enough there. It's really then trying to understand the sorts of interactions I was talking about before. You know, how does the fire interact with the local environment, which is mostly the terrain and the wind, and then how the escalation in the fire behaviour interacts with the deeper atmosphere.
So that's, I guess, a tipping point situation where once you hit a certain amount of fuel, the rest is history. It's interesting because there's been a lot of public discussion about, you know, cautionary burns or prescribed burning in order to reduce fuel loads, and whether or not we're getting that right. And of course, a lot of case studies now are coming to light around Indigenous cultural burning practices and situations in which they might be managing fuel loads to a much greater extent, or even not just fuel loads, but type of vegetation that might be reducing the chances of these catastrophic bushfires happening. It obviously varies greatly around the country. Can you speak to any of this, perhaps our opportunities to use Indigenous knowledge and re-establish cultural burning practices?
Yeah, so I guess there's a few things to note there. I mean, the most important thing to note is when Aboriginal people are doing cultural burning, it's not for the sole purpose of reducing the fuel load or the hazard. It's you know, as the theme of NAIDOC suggests this week, and happy NAIDOC to everybody, coming to you from Ngunnawal country. It's about the overall, you know, promoting the overall health of country. That's what fire is really there for. And, you know, different pieces of country will have, you know, different specific aims that are you know, driving the cultural burning. It's almost like, you know, by caring for the overall health of country, reducing the hazard sort of almost comes as part of the deal. So it's not the you know, the immediate or the sole goal when you do that sort of thing. So having said that, I mean, I think there is potential to think about how you can use cultural burning practices and promoting the overall health of country as part of a suite of mitigation measures you can start to think about to reduce the risk of these extreme fires blowing up. A lot of these fires will initiate in remote and rugged areas, which are the areas normally, you know, more difficult to access for hazard reduction burning and things like that. So, you know, there's real opportunities there, I think, for reconnecting Indigenous people to these remote and rugged areas, and thinking about how you might, you know, reinstate cultural burning in these areas, noting that in a lot of cases the country is very different to what it was 200 or 300 years ago. So there's a bit of a question there about what cultural burning actually means. But I think there's a real opportunity to reconnect Indigenous people with their country and work with Western scientists about how you can sort of use knowledge from both cultures to help us with the problem.
Yeah, and obviously it's a living and evolving cultural practice, so it's one that can work with this new world that we're currently living in. Mary, can I move to you? Within your inquiries and within the policy and planning process, are there opportunities to better connect Indigenous people to country and look at their deep knowledge of the ecosystems that we're living in and the connections to people to actually better manage fires? Oh, you're on mute, Mary.
That was good. Sorry. Happy NAIDOC week from me, and the answer is absolutely. We met with a large number of Indigenous people from across the state, and we held a very big workshop of lots of people who were doing cultural burning and had cultural burning companies, along with Indigenous public servants. And the big issue that came out of that is that people said to us, please stop using the term cultural burning, and said, please use the term cultural land management. That, as Jason said, it's a much bigger issue than just burning for a particular purpose. It's about managing the land well and being close to the land. And it came through as a very, very strong message from us, to us and from us in the inquiry, that it's very important. But as Jason has emphasised, it's part of a suite of things that we can do by itself. It's not going to save us from great bushfires.
And that suite of things includes generally building resilience. If I were to focus specifically on building, because we're getting quite a few questions from the audience actually around resilient homes, do you have specific recommendations, or is there work in progress that might help us build better, help Casey design her new house?
There is, and I suspect Casey knows a lot about it. And there's a lot more to do to understand what particular materials, how we should deal with the changing climate. But I think there's an important thing to say here too, that, and Casey went close to talking about it, you can live in the country that could burn, and could burn very seriously. And as Jason says, we're trying to understand what terrain will burn badly and lead to these extreme fires. But it's fine to live there. It's good to have built a structure that will slow down the fire. But if the extreme fires come to that area, the message is get out. And so we have to learn to live with a very strongly mixed message, a message that we might enjoy living there. We've taken all possible precautions in the way we've built, in the way we've kept vegetation away from our structures. But then if those fires come, we have to go and go very quickly.
Yeah, so your recommendation is just leave, basically. If the fires are on their way, get out. And that speaks to your earlier comment about having multiple avenues to leave.
Yeah, and these are these extreme fires that Jason's talking about.
Yeah. We're having a little problem with your connection, Mary, so I might just move to Richard. And Richard, in terms of building resilience, and I've heard you say it's not about people.
Need to know a lot more. I mean, there's a okay.
Yeah, sorry, Mary, you're breaking up a little bit. We'll get you back online in a moment. I'm just going to move quickly to Richard while we're waiting for Mary to get back online. But she was talking about building structures that are resilient. I'm thinking that you also think about resilience for people as building resilient systems around them, rather than, we're not talking about fixing the people, we're talking about fixing the structure and the systems that will support people in the event of a bushfire or a drought or a major extreme event. Can you speak a little bit about what we as a community need to do to build those structures and to make sure people are supported through what might be a few decades of increasing frequency and severity of extreme events?
Sure, and I think just to highlight what you just said then, Emma, that resilience, I think our field has moved on, that we're not thinking anymore about let's make individuals resilient. Like some people are going to be super survivors and not get phased by a major burn that destroys their house and threatens their lives. We've all get stressed by things that are going to be that overwhelming. So people shouldn't necessarily feel bad if things are getting on top of them. But we know that when season after season, we see this a lot in the firefighters who, particularly in the 1920 season, most firefighters, for example, will, in a typical season might work hard for a month. That particular summer, we know so many who just worked for months and months and months on end, had very long time away from home, often away from work, using up all their annual leave, and they were just exhausted. And then they have COVID, and things just build up and up and up. So it's understandable that people, don't travel too well when things like that happen. When we talk about resilient systems, it's about, I think, working on a couple of levels that we're trying to work on at the moment. Number one, it is working at a community level, and it's very much working at making sure that the social structures get put back into play as quickly as possible. What we saw after Black Saturday, for example, where entire communities were devastated, whole towns were like relocated, and people were just like spread out, hundreds of miles away. And this is not necessarily a good thing, because people's own traditional social networks, their friends, their local church or club or whatever, is lost to them. And this is actually not helpful. So I think when we talk about planning, for example, after a disaster, it's important that we can actually get those structures back together, getting the people who know each other and trust each other and have for a long time, getting those communities back functioning and having the systems in place that allow communities to do it. And that also relies on government coming to the party and helping them to do that. It's not easy, for a single community to do it without the right support. A very simple example is that making sure that government is providing communities with the right sort of communication systems in play after a disaster. When everything's down and people can't communicate, we know one of the most important resilience building strategies that people can have in the immediate time is to be able to connect with one another, to know that each other is safe and to support each other. But you can't do that if communications are down. A very salient example of this is a study going way beyond Black Saturday. It's a study I was involved with Ash Wednesday back in 1983. So now we're going back a long way. And my group, we did a follow-up of people that were initially assessed after the 83 fires when they were young children. They're about 10 years old. And we then followed them up 30 years later. And essentially we found that the kids on the day when those fires went through, they were separated from their parents because it was a school day and it was totally by chance whether you were with or without, not with your parents. Those who were separated from their parents when those terrible fires went through, and they were really bad, 30 years later, their mental health was much worse. And it was associated with the fact that they were, very anxious about not having the support and the connection of parents. And it just highlights that it really has long-term impacts. And so having that social connection is important. But government also has to come and work heavily here. And we are trying to work with government more and more. One of the things we sort of achieved a bit in Black Saturday was we actually got everybody around the table. So we actually had the federal government, federal governments of health and aging. We had the state governments of Victoria. We had Red Cross, who's like the major disaster recovery agency. We had all the relevant players. We had Centrelink, we had everybody. And we actually worked out a very sort of concerted plan to sort of facilitate resilience and to help people sort of manage and to sort of make sure people knew where to go if they needed help, etc. And it involved integrating all sorts of people. It could, you know, we found that most people were off actually seeing their GP or even their hairdresser. Those were the people they were talking to, or the Centrelink officer. They were the people that they were talking to, not counsellors. And so we had to bring those people in to help them work out sort of how do we remove obstacles and help people cope, to sort of connect and to sort of rebuild and to make their resilience stronger. And something like that does need a whole of government sort of response, because it's got to be built into the disaster recovery response, which is very good in Australia, the sort of systemic responses, but the resilience angle needs to be, the psychological resilience is always needing to be built in more.
So on that topic, and I'll bring in both Richard and Casey, because this is an interesting one, given it's coming again from the audience, but I think it speaks directly to what you were talking about then, Richard, about essentially building stronger networks and networks with redundancy. So if one bit slips out, that people aren't left alone. But the question is from the audience, given the bushfire and pandemic experience, what does the panel think about embedding resilience training, managing change, anxiety, stress, and mental health formally into all university courses? So essentially, I'm going to translate that a little bit and to say, what role does the university have, the university community, in building our graduates to have more of that resilience, but also to be able to build resilient structures within society? Richard, have you thought about this? And I think it's in response to all sorts of climate change events, including bushfires. What responsibility do we have to our graduates to skill them up to be able to respond and support their communities?
It's a great question, and I'd answer it in two ways. The idea that we'd be sort of building into university courses how we make people more resilient, I think not. Because to be perfectly honest with you, and I know this isn't a great answer, our capacity to make individuals resilient is not wonderful. A lot of studies done. We do a bunch of them, and we do them in high-risk occupations, you know, like fire and police and people, and they don't work that well. The second, I think, answer is really an interesting one, though, is in university courses, how do we sort of teach graduates from all disciplines how to be more aware of how to setting things up to promote psychological resilience? Now, this could be anything from built environment, you know, from how we build cities and towns, and how we set up our own houses, and everything we're talking about planning for future fire seasons, which covers many disciplines that universities teach, building in the absolute importance of looking after individuals and communities' well-being from their own perspective. Because
so that's great. So you're talking about a disaster response lens to all of the disciplines, and I can see Mary's got her hand up. Mary, is that in response to this?
Yes, it is.
Yeah,
and it's not about bushfire, and maybe it's sort of a question to Richard, but I'm along with a couple of colleagues from Sweden and the UK, writing a book on how universities responded to COVID. And we asked senior leaders, vice-chancellors, we asked academics, we asked students, we asked administrative staff how they responded, to tell us their story, their personal stories, and these are in the book. And what has startled us is the reserves of resilience and innovation and willingness to help and sort the thing out that people found right across the spectrum. And I'm interested, Richard, to know what is that phenomenon, how people, and I saw it in the bushfire inquiry too, that people can find these great reserves in these crises and do amazing things, and then systems become very strong. So we've seen our universities survive the pandemic remarkably well.
Again, that's a great question. I mean, I have seen this all over. We know from every kind of event that most people can be incredibly resilient, and it just stuns us, to be honest. I mean, I've been in refugee camps in Syria and seen people who have been through the most horrendous experiences I won't even tell you about because you wouldn't sleep for a week. And they're just still getting on with their lives, doing what they do, and it just absolutely humbles me. When I dissect why can this person or this family or this group of people do what they do, I think it boils down to purpose. They have a purpose in terms of what they are doing, and I think that's very much what universities do at times like this. We have a pandemic or we have a disaster, and I mean, what do universities? What's their core business? I mean, it's knowledge and it's solving problems. I mean, that's basically what we do. It doesn't matter what our discipline. That's essentially our core business. And so when you have a major challenge like a climate change or seasonal disasters like bushfires or a pandemic, it's a major problem. It's affecting whole populations, and it's our job, and it's what drives us to get up in the morning, to help solve it. And I agree with you, Mary, that I think the universities have been very flexible and been very resilient as institutions in terms of not only surviving themselves or trying to in hard times, but also, trying to work out a community-led response in terms of how to solve the problems. But I see that in communities affected by disasters, like, that have been affected by bushfires. It's the communities that really want to rebuild or help those who are most deeply affected and help them rebuild, and how to sort of, prepare for the next season. I mean, they're the ones that really, seem to be able to adapt very strongly.
And Casey, I'm going to go to you as a student in a university system. Do you feel like we can encourage our students further to be thinking around disaster response and be incorporating that into their learnings and the new knowledge that you're creating, for example, as a PhD student, but also in particular around creating leaders for this new decade or this new couple of decades of quite dramatic, extreme events? Are we doing enough to train our next generation of leaders?
Look, I think I'm off mute. The core skills that you get out of doing a graduate degree kind of do set you up for thinking this way anyway, as others have mentioned. But I mean, it wouldn't hurt, because obviously the spectre of climate change is, ever present, and it's really not going to be going away anytime soon. So expanding those kind of critical skills that we gain during our graduate degrees to consider, yes, more of a disaster focus. I mean, that wouldn't hurt anybody. But that said, we do get a grounding in it. So, it's there and it can be grown organically, I think.
And the reason I focus a little bit on leadership is we are getting a lot of questions now in from the audience. Thank you so much for sending them in, and they're coming through thick and fast, so I'm going to have to move people quickly. But one of the questions was around local leadership, really. And it strikes me, Casey, that as setting up that restoration project, the Restoration Observation Project, you acted as a local leader, which then gives people a bit of hope, gives them something to hang on to, but also connects people in that time period, and especially immediately after the crisis. Did we have enough local leadership in the Southern Highlands that was enabled to be out there and to be in the community?
Interesting question. Just last night, actually, I participated in a listening event as part of the inquiry into the Southern Highlands local government's handling of the bushfire crisis. Sadly, in our little shire, no, it was not handled particularly well. Things that are happening now really should have happened last year. So there were words thrown around last evening, so I'm not putting words in people's mouths, but callousness, lack of empathy, lack of support, being abandoned by upper levels of council. And just a small example is that a lot of people had to send a lot of emails to get council to agree to waive the DA fees, for example, the development application fees for people that were planning to rebuild, in comparison to, say, the Shoalhaven City Council, who during the fires announced that all DA fees for anybody planning to rebuild would be waived, no questions asked. So yeah, it was a bit of a situation where we had our local government, rather than providing, you know, the assistance and, you know, the emotional support that we needed, we really didn't get that.
Yeah, so that does speak to the need for local leadership and local communities coming together. I can see Jason's got his hand up. Jason, can I get you to join in on this conversation?
Yeah, I guess I was just sort of with the discussion around trying to build resilient systems. I mean, one of the first things you need to facilitate that is to really have a good understanding of the hazard that you're dealing with. Now, I think, you know, from a university perspective, we're all taught to have an open mind and to consider things objectively. So there is quite a lot of feeling out there about fire as this kind of known thing. Okay, everyone knows about fire. It sort of burns through the landscape as a sort of a front. You have unburnt stuff ahead of it, burnt stuff behind it, and then you've just got to worry about the bit that's burning. The thing with these extreme bushfires is it really doesn't, they really don't adhere to that script, if you like. You have a completely sort of different set of dynamics at play. So, you know, you might often find the fire behind you before you see it coming up in front of you, things like that. So really what that means is that we don't have a good understanding of the hazard we're trying to deal with. And I think this is going to become more of an issue, you know, under climate change as we get more of these fires. So it's really, I think there's a really strong need there to just sort of, you know, take a step back and just say, well, there's a lot we don't understand about these fires. We don't really have a good understanding of the hazard. So if we want to try and think about how we build resilience, the first thing we really need to do is to try and get a better understanding of that hazard. Once you've done that, then you can start to think about how that then filters through to all the other decisions that you make around building resilience.
So the lines of evidence are rapidly coming together about the drivers of these bushfires. You know, we're getting much more evidence and many more sort of finer scale climate models. But I guess they're very, very, very complicated biophysical events. Will we ever have enough information, or do we have to start making some assumptions in order to, you know, better build and better plan and pivot our emergency responses?
I mean, I think we can do a lot better than what we do now. I mean, I'm not sure we'll ever have a perfect understanding of everything that's going on around us. But, you know, there's a lot going on in the research space now. I mean, you know, the very first thing to say is, well, we've actually admitted that there's that we don't understand the sorts of fires that we're having now. And so that's the first sort of, you know, thing you have to admit before you start to get to the core of the problem. But, you know, just by looking at these things, and there is a lot more technology available to us now, a lot more, you know, satellite data, other remotely sensed technology that we didn't have 40 years ago or even 30 years ago. So we can use those sources of data to really inform our understanding and the research we're doing. There's a whole lot of interesting stuff going on around how you could start to you know, bring in concepts of smart urban design, combining that with some of the new knowledge we have about these hazards. And, you know, you might actually be able to design or, you know, build resilience into new developments, if you like. So I think there's a lot of things like that which are really worth investing in terms of the research. And yeah, there's a lot of exciting stuff going on.
Are there general principles that we might be developing to respond to the mega fires or fire storms, I guess, is what you're talking about in general, for example, and perhaps these are principles for dealing with all bushfires. You know, the sooner you get to it, the more likely you are to prevent the problem, or do we just build in firewall breaks? You know, what are the general principles for dealing with this new type of fire?
Yes, I mean, I often say once these things escalate, it's too late. I mean, the only chance you had to put something out which has escalated to that level was 5 years before. Or perhaps if you're lucky enough, you might get a first attack option to get in there and put it out. First attack option, the success of first attack options really come down to the local area that it's burning in. So if you were lucky enough to have done, hazard reduction burning on a particular piece of land, which was, especially prone to these sorts of dynamic escalations that we're talking about, then that might win you some time to get in and do first attack. So we've done a lot of research around identification of those types of landforms, and they're not the ones that you would expect them to be. It's kind of an anti-intuitive feel to it there. But knowing the sorts of, the bits of terrain where you're going to have the most problems or the most likelihood of your fire doing something strange, which is going to cause it to escalate, if you can then start to think about targeting those things, then that, the potential is there to win you some time with first attack. Once these things escalate, there's really not a lot you can do. It comes down to having a good triage system, if you like, about sort of saying, well, if I've got 50 fires burning in the area, which one or two, hopefully that's all, is going to be the ones which blow up into these extreme bushfire events, and then it's about getting the warnings out appropriately to the people who are likely to be impacted.
Yeah, so that's really speaking to the response, and that's the question that's in the panel here as well. And I might put this to Mary first, and maybe Rich might also want to comment, but to pivot the discussion a little bit to how the medical and or allied health sector should be prepared for these future firestorms or large-scale bushfires. So just wondering if you have anything in specific there in relation to health.
I'm going to leave the health to Richard, but okay. I want to make a comment on the back of Jason's comment, which is that another general principle is that we need to really know where the fire is. One of the big problems, we didn't know where the fire edge was in so many fires this time, or where new spot fires had happened. We had lightning strikes all over the place, but didn't know what had been hit. And we know the technologies, the satellite processing technologies, but we hadn't had appropriate satellites or high altitude drones in place. And one of the things we've got to get in place really quickly is to be deploying these known technologies onto this problem so that we know where the fire edge is, so that we can strike early along the lines Jason mentioned. And I think that's one of the important things that needs to get going. And it's one of the reasons I was pleased the New South Wales government accepted all the 76 recommendations of the inquiry, and there's quite a few on that matter.
Yeah, and that also is a message of hope, really, because it's examining those new technologies and their capacity to help us fight those fires.
And they're actually, some of them are quite old technologies we just are not using adequately at the moment. Some of the satellite technologies, I mean, we have improved them, but we need to deploy them onto this. Doesn't mean we're going to be able to get everything out. We certainly still have to be incredibly wary of the extreme bushfires that Jason's talking about, but at least knowing where they are will help us in knowing where to get people out.
Yes, that would be extremely helpful. So there are new applications of technologies that we've
There are some new technologies, and there's some applications, some very vigorous applications of some very older, much older technologies.
And moving to the pivot of the health system, either the allied health system or the immediate emergency response system. Richard, do you have any comments on whether or not the scale and intensity is going to change the way we structure those systems or how we respond?
Well, if we look at recent history, governments typically just learn from their mistakes, and the question is, how long do they remember what they've learned? And is there sort of corporate memory between governments? I mean, one obvious lesson from the 1920 season is sort of being able to sort of project, in terms of need to manage widespread respiratory illness in the wake of widespread smoke, and having systems in play, to be able to deal with that. But the big challenge that we typically have in the health system, be it across allied health, emergency, everything, is that in the wake of a major disaster, governments get very excited and pour a lot of money in, and it tends to be a knee-jerk reaction, but it's not sustained. And we know that both the physical effects and also the psychological effects can actually be quite long term. And they really need to be planning for that. Now, that's actually a lot costlier. And it does mean that particularly in those regions that have been more affected, it's putting things in play that aren't going to be there for the next year or two or the next budgetary cycle, but are going to be there for as long as the need is indicated that it will be there. And that typically never, ever happens, which is unfortunate. Now, for example, after the 1920 season, Canberra saw, wise to pour lots and lots of money into psychological health all around the country, and there was a big money spend and lots of ministerial announcements, which is normally what we see. And a lot of that will end up hitting the mark and do well. But the question is, will it be long-standing so it's there for the next time round? And as everyone has said on the panel so far, we know there's going to be another time and a time after that and a time after that. But if we've got the systems in play, again, it means that we're prepared, for when they occur, which means we can respond and communities can respond a lot more adaptively.
And it's pivoting the public health system, and all of our experts in that space have done such a great job of dealing with the COVID crisis, to be thinking longer term about natural disaster responses as well, which they already do. But I think you're a little bit harsh on the government. There have been some quite substantial long-term recommendations that have been approved by both national and state governments that I think will help us respond to the disaster. But obviously, we are
Emma, it's never enough for people like me. You know that. We always want more.
I can see that.
And we don't have to pay for it.
But I'm thinking in particular around, our distributed public health network in New South Wales, and how important that has been to our response to the COVID crisis, and how that has been a 10 or 20 year investment in people and training, and that's allowed us to respond to the COVID crisis. And that's the kind of thing that we need to keep thinking about evolving in response to this changing climate crisis. There's a couple of, before I get on my high box, there's a couple of comments here as well as questions I want to get to before I start on the last topic for the evening. And so first of all, Helen Lockheed from the University of New South Wales has said the planning and designing for resilience in the built environment is already part of the University New South Wales courses in relation to architecture, for example. So the new National Architecture Competency Standards also mandate this. So that's a really positive thing, where discipline-specific areas can be looking to this new future and working into their standards, their accreditation, and also just their disciplinary interests, these new responses to climate crises. We also have some questions around, quite a lot of questions around government responses, but I think we have actually dealt with a lot of those. Just looking here. Oh, yes, we have a question which is for Jason. I'll take this as the final question around the kind of nature of bushfires and bushfire modelling before I get on to the final topic. So this is, Jason, a question from Peter. Phoenix models provide the hazard understanding within district bushfire risk management plans. Is there a better modelling approach to inform those plans?
Yes, I mean, the Phoenix model, I'll get a little bit technical here, but the Phoenix model makes a bunch of fairly explicit and limiting assumptions about the way fires behave. So it uses a principle called Huygens principle, which basically says we can model a fire just by assuming that every point on the fire line acts as an independent source fire itself. And then you can just see what each of those little individual source fires do. And then you take the envelope of that, and that gives you the new fire at some later time. The problem with that is that the assumptions underpinning that model aren't valid, and particularly under extreme circumstances, extreme conditions, they're really woefully invalid. We know that each point on a fire line influences every other point, for example. That's how fires will evolve from a straight line to a curved front, for example. So the Phoenix model, while it's useful and has its place in fire prediction, you can't really expect it to be capturing all the things going on in one of these extreme bushfires. There's no nothing in the model which accounts for coupling between the fire and the atmosphere, for example. And so there are models that we've been working on for the last 5 to 8 years with the Bushfire Natural Hazard CRC, with CSIRO Data 61, which are now able to bring in some of those interactive effects, these dynamic effects. So the platform we've developed there is called Spark, it's CSIRO Spark. And so, yeah, that I think is going to be the model which is going to be adopted going forward for fire prediction.
Thanks, Jason. That's great. And I feel like I've learned a lot about bushfires during this conversation, so thank you very much. Look, on to the final topic, and I'm just going to give you each 2 minutes to give your ideas and perspectives here on this one. This decade has been referred to as the critical decade during which strong preventative action is required to address the causes and consequences of climate change. And today we've been talking about a new type of extreme event which is directly linked to climate change. Indeed, as one of the co-chief authors of the State of Environment report for the Australian government, it's the first time this report will have an entire chapter dedicated to extreme events. So I'm acutely aware of the changing nature of these disasters, but also acutely aware of the need for urgent change to prevent further climate change and to reduce the potential for the ecological impact, the social impact and the economic impact. And from an economic perspective, Deloitte Access Economics suggests that 30% of employed Australians and over 30% of national income is exposed to disruption from climate change and unplanned economic transition. And you know what they mean by unplanned economic transitions. It's a response to a major disturbance. Much of those immediate impacts may actually result from extreme events such as bushfires. So a quick question to all of you, and this question comes from the audience in relation to this, is what is the best way to have a meaningful impact on climate change mitigation? You have 2 minutes each, and I'm going to start with Casey. What are you thinking?
I think, sometimes it's hard as an individual to feel like you can really make a difference with something so large, but if everybody does make a difference, then that's a whole lot of people. So I think, looking at the way we consume electricity is a big one. How we move around, the type of vehicles that we choose to use, how we power our homes. These are things that you can do on an individual level that can be within the means of a lot of people, maybe change from gas to induction cooking, have some solar panels on your roof, just making small changes to really send a message that we need to get rid of things like coal fire and gas power, that is going to really help kind of put a handbrake on some of the larger emissions.
Excellent. Thanks, Casey. And Richard, what are you thinking here?
Well, I'm out of my depth here because the question was, how do we impact these events? I typically work on the consequences of the events, not the events themselves. But just putting a more general psychology hat on, I think we just need to alter people's behaviours. So people engage less in behaviours that, for example, exacerbate climate change and are going to behave in more adaptive ways. And governments and communities can do this. And if you look at disciplines like behavioural economics, where they've got concepts such as, nudge theory, which basically uses, different incentives to nudge people in a certain direction, to engage in socially appropriate behaviour. And, the best example of that at the moment is with, vaccines. Give people rewards, get your free this or your free that, with your jab, and all around the world, people are taking up the vaccination a lot more. So governments can do things to encourage people, to do things like obviously carbon taxes and things like that. And we have to shift behaviour though, and there's a lot of science about how we can change people's behaviours.
And there's a lot of science about how we can't change them as well, with some of the old modes of just telling people what the risks are. It is interesting around the motivations being used for vaccinations. Some of them are suggesting that people are more likely to get a vaccination or be incentivized to get it if they're given a lottery ticket for a big prize rather than if they're getting a solid, $50 in the hand. So that I guess there is a lot of research to be done around understanding psychological behaviours and then, encouraging people and incentivizing them to contribute to mitigating climate change. So thanks for that perspective, Richard, and thanks for your contributions. Jason, do you have a primary way in which we can help mitigate climate change or prevent further climate change? Yeah,
I mean, I'm sort of hesitant to sort of, tell other people what they should be doing. I guess I'll answer that just by sort of saying that, talking about the things that I do. And I think one of the really important things I can do from sort of my position is to sort of, resist misinformation. I think, particularly when after the fires, there was a lot of misinformation that came out, a lot of people who knew a lot about bushfire, allegedly, and a lot of what they were saying was just complete nonsense. So, actually speaking up and saying, well, that's not right. Here's what we actually know, and backing that up with solid science where appropriate. I guess the other thing just to point out is that we're all members of a democratic society. We all have a vote. So.
Yeah, we do. Thanks, Jason. Can you just, while you're on it, give us an example of some of the misinformation that you felt, because some of it is probably still out and about? Yeah, I mean, the whole thing about arson was just a complete furphy. I mean, all of the major fires, possible exception of one, were started by lightning. The whole role about not enough fuel reduction was done. The science has told us for probably 30 years that even if you've done a lot of fuel reduction, if you haven't done it in the last 18 months or so, then when the conditions escalate to that sort of level, it's not going to have much of a beneficial effect anyway. So, there's a lot of stuff going on like that where, people are sort of basing opinions on old ideas, which we know don't really hold under these sorts of extreme conditions. Mm-hmm. Really fascinating. Thank you, Jason. And Mary, your contributions on this?
The others have addressed a lot of it, but like I was going to talk about nudge theory too. But to me, one of the biggest issues is information. Talking about the big issues, making sure we have plenty of good discussion as small communities, as large communities, as the whole of Australia, I think is terribly important. And this is why I think it's fascinating to watch people talk about the bushfires and this move to the extreme bushfires, because sometimes that is the thing that highlights what climate change is about and the climate extremes. And I think events like tonight, I think really good articles, television series about it are really important. It's about information, education, discussion, respect, talking about the need for a good economic transition in Australia, talking about resources, thinking laterally. We're really good problem solvers in Australia. So can we think laterally about how we use all our other energy sources? For example, we rarely talk about the fact that we have some of the biggest geothermal energy sources in the world. They're very deep, but there's lots of them. And really getting going in different ways, but talking, discussing it in a respectful way, I think is the real key.
Thanks, Mary. That's fantastic. And it certainly speaks to a lot of what we've been discussing today, that all of you have brought up different ways in which we can help mitigate and prevent further climate change. And it is a whole of systems approach that is necessary. We're going to have individual behavioural change. We're going to have structural change. We're going to have technology-led innovation. And most of all, everybody working together in connected communities that are not only connected with each other, but connected to country. And I think that's a nice way to circle back to NAIDOC Week, to Healing Country, and the importance of reconnecting Indigenous peoples and traditional custodians with their cultural heritage, with their connections to country, respecting those connections, but also protecting and building them so that we can learn from them. And I think everybody's stewardship of country will be enhanced by that reconnection. but most importantly, everybody's reconnection to country and stewardship of country will benefit them directly as well. And as an ecologist who works closely with marine ecosystems, I can vouch personally for that particular fact. We have had a wonderful discussion this evening. It's been difficult at times, and we are facing a really terrible new reality around extreme bushfires. So thank you for all of you who have contributed to that discussion. Thank you to Jason, Richard, Mary and Casey for your time, for your expertise, your thoughtful reflections there. Thank you also to our audience. You've been peppering me with wonderful questions. I haven't managed to get to absolutely every question. Hopefully I've got to the majority of them, but we also will be posting some further information in the chat and some resources so that you can start doing your own research in these particular areas. If nothing else, we may have inspired you into a new line of research on the web, and also reaching out to your communities for knowledge that's embedded in those systems. We'll also send a full recording of this discussion via email. And again, if anyone needs support or assistance, please see the link in the chat and in those post communications. The bushfires of 2019-20 were preceded by a decade of increasingly dry conditions, record-breaking heat, and 2 years of extremely low rainfall. They were the result of a drastically changing climate, and that climate is only becoming more extreme. Research like you've heard about today across all of the different disciplines that we've spoken to needs urgent support to ensure we are better able to understand these new extremes and build resilience to them. If you're interested in how you can support research on extreme bushfires, bushfire regeneration, trauma, or any of the other areas we covered this evening, further information will also be included in the email we'll send you out with the recording. So thanks again for your time and interest. Happy NAIDOC Week and good evening from UNSW.
Fur trails and the byways, the only way to get anywhere. The smoke haze makes a dark day, fills your lungs with ash and despair, and the prayers of the people cut off by the fire line. Birds fly in dense clouds, don't look back, there's no delay. Wildlife crosses treacherous highways, gambling for another day. Hear the prayers of the people cut off by the fire line. Line offer their lives up, most return for another day. Haunting memories follow, they must learn to hold them all at bay. Hear the prayers of your heroes, the nightmares of broken heroes cut off by the fire line. It was just a dream left behind by your father, your family torn apart at the seams. Hear the prayers of your loved ones cut off by the fire line. Widen and black, dead and new. The earth is bare, where tall trees grew. But I see the green coming through, making all things new. New shoots rise where old limbs fell, like the saints let out of hell. Creation wakes, it makes a way. This land will sing with birds again. Fire up, there's no time for you to mourn. What's gone is slowly being reborn. Stand tall and open your weary eyes. From the ashes we will rise. Fractured boulders, as bare as bones, they scar the earth. All is exposed. The mighty cedars, the gums and firs are breaking through now. The bush returns. Fire up, there's no time for you to mourn. What's gone is slowly being reborn. Stand tall and open your weary eyes. From the ashes we will rise. Yes, I see the rain rolling through, washing all things new. From the ashes, hope it prevails. For those whose eyes are off themselves, fear will flee where courage stands. Put on your boots now and lend a hand. Fire up, there's no time for you to mourn. What's gone is slowly being reborn. Stand tall and open your weary eyes. From the ashes we will rise.